Good morning, everyone. My name is Etienne Aldarondo. I'm the Executive Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment. I want to thank you all for choosing to spend this day with us and promise you that we have a very exciting event and a very important event for all of you educators, policymakers, researchers, and clinicians. I'd like to start our event today with some words of by our founding board member and president, Lena.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this, our 27th annual conference of the Melissa Institute. Today is a very difficult day for Michael and me. It is the 28th year and actual day of Melissa's murder. She was murdered 2 weeks before her graduation from Washington University in St. Louis. And she was the victim with a friend of a carjacking. There were two teens with stolen handguns who basically abducted the girls. Melissa was shot and killed immediately, and the friend was shot and killed and left for dead, but miraculously survived to identify the assailants and go on to lead a wonderful and productive life, fortunately. We know that violence has been present since the beginning of civilization, and we also know that Melissa was very interested in the subject of violence prevention. She wrote that since the beginning of civilization, violence has been present, yet women always found a way to try to combat violence. And that was a message from me. And so I'm very proud of the work that the Melissa Institute has done all of these years. You will be able to go on our website and look and see all of the previous conferences. The information that we have on there is incredible and vast, and I encourage you to do so. In addition, today's conference will be available in a few weeks to your friends and colleagues, and we hope that you will share this wealth of information with them. I also want to thank our scientific members who are presenting today, and I know that you will gain a lot from your good judgment of attending the conference. So I encourage you to take notes and pay attention and help us in this fight against the epidemic of violence in this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for everything you do for us every day and for joining us in this special day. Okay, so here we are. We are at a moment in which we know that Congress has appropriated funds to make schools safer and pedagogically more effective. And this virtual conference is intended to focus on how to effectively use this opportunity to meet the daunting challenges students, families, and administrators face, including, as you know, school shootings, violence, bullying, and the emotional and behavioral sequel of adverse childhood experiences. Research shows that peaceful schools do not arise simply from installing bulletproof windows, arming teachers, or expelling troublemakers. Instead, peaceful schools come when the academic and social emotional needs of the students within its walls are understood and substantially met in culturally appropriate ways. Today, the Melissa Institute's internationally renowned faculty will share research-based knowledge, programs, and practices necessary to create safe, inviting, and academically effective schools. I want to remind you all too that if you are attempting to complete continuing education or receive continuing education credits, you need to kind of follow up the guidance of your specific organizations, and as well as kind of like be mindful that that you have to complete the evaluation at the end of the conference in order to qualify for continuing education credits. You would also at one point in the a couple of points during the conference, you will see a word appear on the screen. If you are applying for continuing education credits, you need to record that word, and it'll be a couple of times, and then you have to submit it with your evaluation and documentation as just a simple proof that you were there. And so without saying anything more, let me just then leave you now with Ron Slavy, and who, as you know, is a developmental psychologist, research scientist, and educator, who is previously an associate professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and currently serves as senior scientist at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. You can read more about him in the program description, as well as that in the website, the Melissa Institute website. Take it, Ron.
Thank you, Etienne and Lynn, for the introductions, and good morning to everyone. Welcome to the 27th Annual Conference of the Melissa Institute. As they said, my name is Ron Slaby, and I have the honor and the great pleasure of leading off this conference with my presentation on school safety and violence prevention, lessons learned and challenges ahead. Let me take you back in time to April 20th, 1999, and remind you of the massive school shooting in Columbine High School that left 15 students dead and 24 students injured. This tragic event was immediately followed by a series of other school shootings that shocked the nation. But these first highly publicized school shootings also led to an unprecedented outpouring of federal funding and support, which in turn generated some of the most innovative and valuable violence prevention research and school safety programs in our history. In order not to forget these advances, I'll present some of the critical lessons we've learned in the decades following Columbine. Unfortunately, during this period, the important school safety and violence prevention research from 1997 to 2020 was largely for political reasons. The US Congress put a freeze on gun safety research, and any CDC funding used to research to advocate or promote gun control. And to make things worse, in 2004, the US Congress allowed the 10-year ban on assault-style weapons to lapse, despite evidence of its effectiveness. Since Columbine, school shootings and mass shootings have increased to unheard of levels, and firearms have now become the leading cause of death among children and teens. And assault-style AR-15 weapons are now account for 25% of gun sales, and they've become the weapon of choice in mass shootings. Because the issue of firearm safety is so large and multifaceted, I've decided to defer the discussion of it to our question and answer panel session that follows our morning presentations. Instead, I'll focus this presentation on the valuable and often overlooked lessons we've learned during the early period of innovative and federally funded school safety programs. The slide that you see right now I'll use as a metaphor for connecting our two best types of knowledge, evidence from research and wisdom of practice. And as you see in this slide, there's a gap between the two. There's an old joke, in fact, that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So what I'd like to focus on today is how those bridges are built so that the evidence from research can be effectively used in school settings and in the community. And I'll focus on the question of how those bridges are built and how do we bridge this gap between evidence and practical wisdom. Starting on the research evidence side of this gap, and building toward the practice side, I'll give you a quick reminder of the enormous progress we've made to better understand and prevent bullying and other forms of violence. But mainly, I'm going to focus on some key lessons that have been learned about building out from the practice side toward meeting the research evidence in the middle of the bridge. I'll make this process more concrete by showing you several video snapshots of school staff describing in their own words the practical lessons they've learned while implementing school safety programs. Now, on this slide, evidence from research, we see, I'll give you a quick flashback and thumbnail sketch of the enormous research evidence we've generated in the last 2 decades that help us understand and prevent bullying, for example, in school violence. I'll go through this rather quickly, but just to remind us of where we've come from in the past 2 decades. We've first of all defined bullying, the key in a consensus kind of way. We've defined the key roles, the types of bullying that occur, whether it's verbal, physical, social, indirect, relational, and also cyberbullying, and some of the risk factors for bullying. We've identified short and long-term consequences of bullying to the perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and others, and especially vulnerable targets for bullying based on race, ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ plus status, and so on. And we've developed and evaluated peer-reviewed bullying prevention programs. Federal agencies have reviewed the evidence of effectiveness and the effectiveness of training, support, fidelity, cost effectiveness of program implementation. The federal agencies have vetted, listed, and recommended or required the use of evidence-based programs, which was a major step forward. We've also broadened to the individual responses from the individual responses to the whole school approach to bullying prevention. We've examined school responsibilities and liabilities for allowing bullying. We've provided mental health and trauma-based supports for victims, which you'll hear more about in our later sessions. We've also added new strategies for bullying prevention, bystander strategies, training of school resource officers in bullying prevention, national educational media campaigns, international comparisons, and forums for bullying prevention. And we've adopted state bullying prevention laws in all 50 states. And we've also provided federal funding for major bullying prevention and school safety grants, supported schools and communities with training and technical assistance. So that's a thumbnail sketch of where we've come from. Let's look at our next slide. To tell this story more thoroughly, I'd like to describe the experience that I had at the National Center for Mental Health Promotion and Youth Violence Prevention. This was a center that was funded by the US Department of Health and created at Education Development Center near Boston in partnership with the American Institutes of Research in Washington, DC. And we had the opportunity for many years, for 14 years, to provide training and technical assistance to major projects, including more than 1,000 middle school coordinators and their evaluators, which we trained for 5 days in groups of 100 each for years, and then sent them back to their schools to implement evidence-based programs, and providing them with support throughout with podcasts and follow-up sessions of training. Then we also focused on the youth violence prevention programs that was funded by the US Department of Health. And this entertained innovative programs in communities and schools to curb youth violence. And then finally, and most thoroughly, were 386 Safe Schools, Healthy Students grantees during the years 1999 to 2023. This was the largest program in history. Next slide. So I'd like to focus on what we did and describe a little more thoroughly the Safe Schools, Healthy Students program. Why did I choose this? Well, it began in 1999, immediately following the Columbine shoot and other school shootings. It was the most comprehensive school safety program in US history. It was the first program that was jointly developed and funded by 3 federal agencies working together. I might point out that these federal agencies, the US Department of Education, Justice, and Health and Human Services, had never really worked together on a single project to this extent. They all jointly funded and worked together to create this program called Safe Schools, Healthy Students. It was the first program to pool data across grantees. That is, rather than simply looking at individual success or effectiveness or ineffectiveness in a particular school, which they also did, they also pooled the data with common measures that allowed the entire project to be analyzed and evaluated for effectiveness. Did the pooled data from everyone show that the project was indeed working? And part of the reason this was done is so much money was being poured into this project that the major evaluator from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Agency said she never wanted to go, this was Dr. Susan Keyes, said she never wanted to go before Congress and be asked the question, we've spent over $1 billion on this program, does it work? And all she could say is, well, in Iowa, in this small school, we found this, and in Nebraska, we found this. She wanted to be able to have a summary statement as well about the effectiveness of this program. This program was awarded during the first 14 years, $1.6 billion to 386 schools and communities in all 50 states. And it served 13 million students. So let's look at the next slide. Yes, this is the scatter plot of where the programs were carried out over those years. And you can see all 50 states are represented. Okay, and let's look at the next slide. Okay, well, I'll describe then what they found. First of all, Pueblo, Colorado, and then I'll talk about Albemarle. Pueblo, Colorado found that they had just a simple change that they made, and that was all of the teachers, together with the students, decided they're going to be positive and support each other in positive statements and in positive behavior throughout the day. The PBIS taught them how to do this. It got them all together, working together. And what they found was that there were, they found that they created a shared vision with the teachers, the students, and the parents. And this created an acronym called PRIDE. It was an acronym that stood for prevention, respect, integrity, discipline, and excellence. And their pride was carried through in their behavior each day. And as a result of these changes and buying into and being trained and then working with the parents in the community, they found that the disciplinary incidents were cut in half. Now, each of the disciplinary incidents took up a great deal of time besides being a problem, but cutting them in half was an enormous savings of time. So any time that they felt like they spent with this evidence-based program was well spent, and there was a much happier school. Disciplinary events were cut in half, and violence and bullying, and they had 0 suspensions for an entire year, which they had never had before in their history. So this was a great success story based on adopting, in particular, one program and carrying it out through their entire county. And instead of saying, you know, don't run in the halls, they'd say, please walk. They'd very simple things, they thought, but it was every single teacher then bought into it, and the parents bought into it and supported it at home as well. So this was a great success story, and that's the story of Pueblo, Colorado. It would probably be more effective if you heard it directly from them. Let me know if you do, or if you're able to solve the problem, or otherwise I'll just go on describing it. Secondly was Albemarle, Virginia. Albemarle, Virginia had this was a high school rather than grade schools. It was at not only one high school, it was a series of high schools throughout their county. They implemented 10 evidence-based programs. They chose them specifically to deal with violence prevention or drug abuse prevention, or to increase the services that were given for mental health in to children in the community, in the schools. And they improved their academic outcomes, and their discipline instances also went down. But they said that there was one thing, a major lesson that they learned. And the lesson was that positive relationships were the foundation for making the evidence-based programs work. Of course, you wanted to implement the programs with fidelity, but teachers who focused only on the content and not on building the relationships first with the youngsters, with the teenagers, had very little effect. But when they spend daily sessions called discussion circles, and every morning they would meet in circles and have the students discuss with the teachers how their day was going, what their concerns were for the day, and getting to know each one, so the teachers got to know each one, and the students got to know the teachers better too, because they were very personal and developed very strong positive relationships. So the major lesson here was that positive relationships make evidence-based programs work. And you can use all the evidence-based programs in the world, they said, but if you had one thing to focus on, it's building those positive relationships. And they did it primarily through discussion circles every morning. So that's two of the programs. Let me know if you have any luck with, in the meantime, with getting the other 2 programs I'd like to show, getting the sound available, because that will be coming up later in my talk. Now let's take a look at how the bridges were built. Elders, who was the former US Surgeon General, once said, "Collaboration has been defined as an unnatural act between non-consenting adults." She was quipping that collaboration often is very difficult. Nevertheless, in order to apply for a grant, schools and communities, districts had to collaborate by first forming a core leadership team. Then, by working together throughout the grant period. In order to even apply for the grant, each member had to sign a letter declaring their willingness to participate. Often for the first time, these community leaders were meeting, and they had, in some cases, never even met each other or certainly not work together in any consistent way. But they found out there were many benefits from this partnership that was built, and that was a strong lesson learned about what's needed. Every grant had a project director who was a full-time employee and with great management skills. The project director was full-time because the federal agencies wanted to make sure that a part-time person could be, for example, given cafeteria duty by the principal and wouldn't be able to turn it down. And they wanted to avoid that. They said, project directors need to be full-time focused entirely on this project. And they found it was great benefits to having a very skilled single project director. There was also an experienced evaluator. And then the school superintendent for the school district or principal, if it was just for one school, was involved. The police chief or sheriff, the mental health director, the director of early childhood development, and the training and technical assistance coordinator were all involved throughout the entire grant. Well, what happened was that they found great benefits in terms of, number one, sustainability. After the grant was over, many times grant-funded projects stop immediately after the grant was over. In this case, many times it continued, and it has been sustained sometimes throughout the entire next decade with these core leadership team. And another benefit is that they were dealing with unanticipated problems in a very effective way. One school, for example, that we worked with had the tragedy of 3 teen girls committing suicide, apparently in an unrelated but maybe modeled way or a contagious way. And they suddenly were faced with a major problem of 3 suicides happening immediately. They said, had they not kept this core leadership and formed this core leadership group that had worked together, even though it was for other purposes, and they never anticipated suicide would be a major problem, they found that they were able to carry out solving this problem without pointing their fingers at each other, which they said they would certainly have begun to do, and starting to blame each other or working in an uncoordinated way. So the coordination of having a core leadership team was very effective. Now let's look at what this slide, evaluate each question. The Safe Schools Healthy Students grant had these questions to answer. Did the program reduce violent incidents in the school? Did it improve school climate? Did it reduce alcohol and other drug abuse? In some cases, the schools added alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. Did it improve mental health services? Did it develop and enhance collaborative systems? This is a very large task to be implementing in all of these areas to make your school safer in many ways. But this was the charge that they had, and they had the support of a leadership team and a funding to do it. And let's look at the next slide. They had evidence-based programs to select from. This is an example of the most frequently used evidence-based programs among 40 grantees in the year 2005, just as a little sample. I don't know if you can read effectively, but the programs were the Incredible Years, the Ovea's Bullying Prevention Program, the Peer Mediation Curriculum, Reconnecting Youth. As we have heard about Pueblo, Colorado, the Positive Behavioral Intervention and Supports, PBIS program, Project Alert, Strengthening Families, Second Step, Too Good for Drugs and Violence, Life Skills Training, and Parents as Teachers. I mean, there were many more programs to choose from because fortunately, the federal agencies, each of those three federal agencies, education, justice, and health, had spent several years vetting and examining submissions of whether a program could be determined as being effective and being an evidence-based program, either in the short term, which they called promising programs, or in the longer term over several years. If they could give evidence of effectiveness over several years, it was called an exemplary program. And so there were many choices that they had to deal with these evidence-based programs. And equally important, they did not list programs that failed to show effectiveness, such as the very popular and expensive program that was being delivered by the school resource officers called DARE. The DARE program was very expensive and very heavily used, and yet it had not shown effectiveness and therefore was not listed, much to the chagrin of the people using DARE. The Drug Abuse Resistance Education is what it stood for. As one cynical police officer told me, it meant DARE, it meant donuts are real expensive. Anyway, schools were asked to select, to receive training, and to implement these evidence-based programs that best serve their needs. In this next slide we see now, one of the best things that we could do was take a major step forward to teach and require grantees to fully develop what is called a logic model for their entire project. To organize and manage this complex grant most effectively. What's the advantage of a logic model? I would recommend this for any major project that is being carried out in the schools. And what happened in the Safe Schools, Healthy Students project was that before they could even begin implementing any of the programs and taking any major steps, the first thing they did was to have the core leadership team come up with a clear logic and very specific logic model. It allowed them to visualize the big picture, to organize all stakeholders and their duties, to establish clear goals, monitor steps of progress, and make corrections ongoing and improvements as you went along, and to accomplish your goals effectively. What is a logic model? Let's look at the next slide and I'll show you an example of a logic model. Next slide, please. This is a logic model for one of the schools that was focusing on the element of school safety and violence prevention, in particular bullying prevention. And I know since you can't read this, probably, I'll show you that, first of all, that the needs and that at the top line, you'll see in the columns, each one has a heading. And they had to fill in each of those headings very specifically and decide what their entire logic for the project would be. I'll read you some of these and let's move to the next slide and I'll show you what they did for each of the headings. Next slide, please. These are the headings at the top, the needs or gaps that they saw. For this particular one, as an example, they saw that there, for the middle school grades of grades 6 through 8, showed higher levels of reported bullying, being threatened, being pushed around in school or on the way to and from school. And they also found in a school-wide survey that students reported, 35% of students reported that they were experienced bullying in those ways, or that they reported staying home from school because they did not feel safe in school, or on the way to and from school, at least one time they stayed away from school in the past 30 days. So they were showing enormous, this particular school, enormous reduction in attendees because of bullying. And they found out that 35% of their students were experiencing bullying, whereas in the state survey, only 25% of the, well, I shouldn't say only, that's still significant, but far less than what they were experiencing. So they said there's no reason why we need to be at the upper end, why we can't at least come down to 25%. And that's going to be our goal. So their goal, the second level, was to reduce the level of bullying among middle school grades 6 through 8, and to decrease physical violence in middle school grades on the way to and from school, as well as in school. Their element was to look at the one aspect of the program. They did a whole logic model, by the way, for drug abuse prevention, but this particular one was for bullying and school violence and school safety. The objectives, they identified their short-term objective and their longer-term objective. Their short-term objective was to get the students to use the peer mediation strategies program, and they wanted 25% of the students using and illustrating this use in their data from the baseline by the year 2008. This was several years after they began their program. So they had a moderate goal of 25% of students using this new program. And their long-term goal was to reduce the percentage of students in grades 6 through 8 who indicated they were bullied from 35 to 25%, to bring it down to the state standards at least, and to increase the percentage of students who were attending school as well. Under the activities, they listed purchasing the curriculum, training the staff, arranging the school schedule to accommodate the curriculum, and giving priority to that, obtaining parental permission for student participation as needed. And their longer term activities were to implement the evidence-based bullying prevention programs in order to achieve their specific objectives. Their partners were the mental health partner was going to assist this training of teachers, and teachers were going to deliver the bullying prevention programs, and students who exhibited high levels of risk would be referred to the mental health partners and services. So you can see this whole program was thought through right down to all of the potential experiences that they might face in the future. And so before they even started, they had anticipated carrying this entire project out over several years. The process measures were taking data on the number of teachers who were trained, the number of students who were exposed to the curriculum, the number of sessions delivered, and so on. And then finally, they had outcome measures. They were allowed in each Safe Schools, Healthy Students project to develop as many of their own measures as they chose, together with their evaluator, their trained evaluator. And they had several of those measures. In particular, they added, for example, like experiencing bullying to and from school, as well as within the schools. But then they were required to use GPRA measures, it's called. GPRA stands for Government Performance Review Act measures. They were required to use these standardized measures of the effectiveness of the program so that across all grantees, they could pool their data and see the entire effectiveness of this Safe Schools, Healthy Students program across particular grantees, as well as how effective it was with their own measures for the particular grantees. So let's go, can we go backwards 1 second to this is the logic model then, and I would recommend that any project like this develop a logic model that shows you, that connects you really to the way researchers look at and do research. the kind of research that educators do is different from the kind of research that we do when scientists do controlled research, because there were typically no control groups. But what the schools were interested in and what they felt like they could do is simply the before-after changes. That they wanted to show reductions in bullying, and they wanted to do it immediately and didn't have the opportunity to begin to do randomized interventions with a control group, with proper control groups. That wasn't their goal. Their goal was to simply show effectiveness. So let's go ahead to 2 slides ahead. And this is an evaluation outcome, for example, pooled across 17 grades in the very first 2 years of the program, just as they were getting started, just to see if they were already showing effects, which presumably the effects would be even greater as they continued to use the programs and became more experienced in delivering those programs and so on. So this is what they found in the first 2 years. Students reported 5% reduction in classroom bullying, modest reduction, 8% reduction in classroom fighting. They also reported 11% reduction in being verbally abused by a student, and a 21% reduction feeling threatened by a student. And teachers reported increase in classroom orderliness, increases in student ability to cope with conflict, and an increase in feelings of community in schools. These are modest changes, but nevertheless effective in the right direction, and many of them significant, all of them significant in terms of statistical analysis at the 5% level, significant, except for the 8% reduction in classroom fighting, which was also, however, was also something that was valued, the reduction in classroom fighting, even though not statistically significant. So what we see is the evaluation outcomes can be successful. Now let's move ahead. I'll describe Amarillo, Texas. Maylin Huntley, one of the most creative project directors we worked with, describes the fact that she never experienced cyberbullying, so she didn't know how to deal with it, but the students certainly did, and it was a major problem. They had problems in all sorts of different kinds of cyberbullying problems, including what was called sexting, where you send nude pictures of your girlfriend to your friend, and before you know it, you're being considered you could be considered a sex offender, for example. I gave a talk to all of the grantees on cyberbullying and how to deal with it, and one of the things I said is students have to realize that what they do online in social discussions, what they do online is forever for everyone. So Maylene immediately picked up on this, and she created a program called Forever, using the number 4, ever, for everyone. And this campaign then was used throughout the school to engage and involve students. And she said the students need to be part of coming up with the program, coming up with the interventions. And so one of the ways she involved them was to get them to make their own videos. And they made videos about how to stop cyberbullying. And this had a great effect. And then she involved them in what is called an acceptable use plan, an AUP. The acceptable use plan is something that I recommend. Students often have terrific judgment about how best to implement and how best to build that bridge between evidence and wisdom of implementing a program. So the acceptable use plan involved personal pledges that students made, and they would sign to be respectful online and to report cyberbullying to the proper places whenever they saw it online, and to encourage each other to be cyberbullying preventers. These personal pledges, they carried out in a number of ways. One way was to, they actually got PVC tubing, and they built what they called a jail in the hallway of the high school classroom. And a student would be in it, and before class, as students were passing, they were just stunned by what is this youngster doing, this student. And he said, I've been charged with sending a nude picture of my girlfriend, and they want to charge me with being a sex offender unless I can get 20 of you to sign this pledge that you will never do this yourself. And so students were signing this pledge. They thought it was a great skit that they carried out. Maylin also got the media, the local media involved, and the news, which previously had said, it's 10 o'clock and do you know where your kids are? They now said, it's 10 o'clock and do you know where your kids are online? And they had then public service announcements that were presented on the air by the mayor of the town about cyberbullying, by the superintendent of the schools, by some of the well-known teachers and sports figures. So they did an educational campaign that, again, came from the ideas of the kids as well as the core leadership team. It was an amazing, and they also then gathered data. And the data they gathered, they found, for example, who would you most be embarrassed if they found out that you were doing something online that was either sexting or cyberbullying? And the girl said, I'd be most embarrassed if my father found out. And the boy said, I'd be most embarrassed if my grandmothers found out. And so they already had thought through what would be some of the consequences of embarrassment for being a cyberbully in various ways. So students were taking the initiative to form this program called Forever for Everyone campaign. Now let's turn to the San Diego, California. They found this was a school that was entirely troubled students who had been expelled from other schools. I wish you could hear it in their own words, but I'll just tell you that the mental health counselors met with parents and students, and they provided counseling and mental health supports for all of the students. And on the video, the youngster that they interviewed, for example, was saying, I always thought that having a therapist was only if you were a crazy person. But I found out that they helped me to control my anger, and I'm staying in school as a result. And they found that they actually had fewer dropouts from school. They had success rates of solving the problems more quickly, and they had the benefits of connecting mental health with education for a focus on prevention. Now, I'd like to end with, in the last few minutes here, with 10 lessons we've learned. Can we look at those from the examples I gave in the 4 schools, but plus what other things that we've learned in the years of carrying this out in the Safe Schools Healthy Students program? These are the quick lessons. Teachers' positive behavior can reduce student disciplinary incidents. We know that now, that something as simple as positive behavior can be much more effective than you might anticipate. Cutting down school discipline in that Pueblo school in half and having no kids suspended in an entire year. Shared values created among parents and teachers, such as I explained in the Albemarle, Virginia school, can reduce school violence and improve academic performance. Discussion circles, also in Albemarle, Virginia, and in many other places, can build strong teacher-student relationships, but strong relationships can help evidence programs work well. The fifth lesson is empowered students can create and maintain effective cyberbullying programs and acceptable use plans. And bystander involvement can help to prevent bullying and even school shootings. Next slide. Communities involved in violence prevention campaigns can have broad effects, and mental health supports for students and their families is a key part of comprehensive education and should be wherever available given in every school. Empowered and supported students can actually become the violence preventers of their generation if given the opportunity and the support. And as we see, I think nationally, that's already happening. And each school's climate contributes to either increasing or preventing violence. The two are tied together. School climate and violence prevention are created, they're not given. They're based on relationships, perceptions, and behavior that can be changed, and everyone contributes to safe schools and violence prevention. Next slide. Back to the effective bridges. So we've seen 10 different examples of building that bridge between evidence and wisdom. But what we need to do is to look ahead. Last slide. These are challenges ahead that can be discussed during our question and answer panel if you'd like. I wish we had time to go through each of these, but we can at least have questions and answers for some of these. First and foremost, school shootings and firearm safety are challenges ahead, as we know. Bullying due to race, ethnicity, LGBTQ status, and disability have not been as thoroughly investigated and dealt with as it should be. Trauma-based care for students is essential. Cyberbullying, and particularly the new artificial intelligence tech developments, are going to produce more opportunities for devious kinds of cyberbullying that will be difficult to control and will need to be up to the task of adapting cyberbullying programs to deal with these new developments. And finally, and most importantly, the political will and federal funding that was available to create some of these lessons learned and to connect the research evidence and practical wisdom needs to be again given. The programs that had major effects were then subsequently reduced in the funding, and now there are no grants given to individual schools, they're given only to states. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me. I wish